On numerous occasions, Pat Condell has derided the idea of criminalizing individuals who commit adultery, and the liberal elite of the godless European superstate, the EU, has determined upon helping to ensure it is no longer possible to punish the adulterous, treating their actions as a victimless crime, and threatening, expelling, or excluding any country with a legal system which dares to criminalize them. This was the case in 2004, when Turkey's governing party attempted to pass laws prohibiting extramarital affairs. The EU responded by threatening to bar any future Turkish accession to the Union. As we approach the closure of the first decade of this new century, the destruction sown by rejecting the biblically instituted family of father, mother, and children, and the refusal to acknowledge the sanctity of heterosexual marriage, is certainly being reaped on the streets of Britain. Writing in the Daily Mail newspaper, on the 9th of December 2009, Alison Pearson noted that, quote, "We know that 1 in 10 children from broken families is left feeling suicidal by the rift, while many more seek solace in drink, drugs, and crime." Statistics from the United States are comparable. They show children coming from homes in which the father is absent are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 32 times more likely to run away from home, 20 times more likely to have behavioral disorders. Boys are 14 times more likely to commit rape, 9 times more likely to drop out of secondary education, 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances, 9 times more likely to end up in a state-operated institution, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. These are the very real effects of a crime accounting for hundreds of thousands of divorces and family breakups annually, a crime which Pat and the EU would lead us to believe is a victimless freedom of the godless. Given the miserable consequences arising from a breakdown of the biblical family structure, the Torah's directive on the appropriate punishment for adultery is certainly proportionate to the crime. The Torah is resolute that providing the conviction of the accused individuals is beyond doubt, the culpable must be executed for their crime. No matter how the godless try to dress it up, adultery is a wicked and indulgent crime which impacts the whole of a society negatively. The problem for civilized people is exasperated by the refusal of the godless to accept life as anything more than a collection of, and pursuit for, personal highs, that boundaries are not subjective psychological barriers within the minds of individuals, and that society is not a burden or impediment. Godless freedom consistently demonstrates itself to be nothing more than existentialism, a hedonistic philosophy which, when carried to its logical conclusion, is nihilism by any other name. After the godless are derailed by their own hedonism, have destroyed the lives of their children, have ensured that, if they make it to adulthood at all, these children will, as a collective, negatively impact the lives of millions of other people in the process, and have secured their corruptive ideology for future generations, it's always the comparatively decent members of society who are left to pick up the pieces. While the members of churches and synagogues step in with social regeneration projects, queue up to assist or fund charity organizations and risk their lives preaching, serving, and counseling on some of the meanest streets Britain has to offer, those responsible for the train wreckage turn to the very people they so gleefully despise, sponging not only off their goodwill, but also their taxes, making use of, for example, the National Health Service's medical treatment and rehabilitation programs, not to mention its abortion services, which all working people in Britain are forced to fund, regardless of whether or not they object to their taxes being used to fund the termination of human life and the facilitation of decadence. How democratic! How liberal! Again, the pattern is transatlantic and exposes an universal ethic of parasitism and self-interest among these godless social Darwinists. Not long ago, ABC News ran a story in which it reported theists were not only more likely to give to charity than atheists, they gave 4 times as much when they did. Suckling nonchalantly on the teat of humanity, baring their teeth, and smirking while glutting their insatiable appetites, the godless are happy to exist somewhere between parasitism and oblivion, all the while contributing nothing, and showing no respect for those who do. Talk about biting the hand that feeds. They aim to engineer a Western empire in which they are able to indulge their wildest and darkest impulses, free from consequence and restraint. Due in no small part to the state-obedient stance of mainstream churches and their faithful, they are halfway to succeeding. The final part of this video series will include sources citing the relationship between atheism, adultery, alcohol and drug abuse and general criminality. Additionally, PTAW will shed light on exactly how your taxes are being squandered by our wonderful godless democracy. PTAW asserts that regardless of the concerted efforts of the godless social Darwinists, the truth remains a defense. The evidence speaks for itself. The family unit must be defended at all cost, and any attempt to undermine it must be met with decisive action, not with the redundant moral relativism of the godless and the gutless. The alternative is a future far too bleak for the majority to tolerate just to appease the self-absorbed and delinquent. In defense of marriage and morality, Rabbi Yeshua, the historical Jesus, our moral authority, consented in principle to the stoning of a woman allegedly caught in the act of adultery, ruling, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." John, chapter 8, verses 3 to 11. Liberal theologians dishonestly portray this event as Jesus turning a blind eye to fornication. The reality is the opposite. These same theologians deliberately neglect to apply any scriptural and historical context to the passage of Scripture. They intentionally fail to factor in a number of considerations at work in the text that a. The preceding verses clearly state the intention of the woman's accusers was to trap Yeshua in his words. b. That the whole of Judea was under the legal jurisdiction of the occupying Roman power. Only a Roman authority could legally put any person to death within its territories. We find this acknowledged by the Jewish religious leaders in John 18:31, reading, "Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law." The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. The woman's accusers were simply looking for an opportunity to hand Yeshua over to Rome as an insurrectionist. Bible commentator Ken Collins writes eloquently of the trap set for Yeshua by his antagonists, explaining that, under the Roman occupation, the power of capital punishment was reserved by the Romans for themselves. All capital cases had to be referred to the Roman authorities and the sentence had to be approved before it could be carried out. So Jesus' enemies figured they could trap him in a dilemma by presenting him with a clear-cut case where the Jewish law demanded the death penalty by public stoning. If Jesus deferred to the Romans, he discredited himself as a teacher of the law. If he condoned the stoning, the Romans would consider him an insurrectionist and put him to death. Either way, they thought, he couldn't win. He would either lose his credibility or his life. Either way, he would be silenced. C. The accusers of the woman did not produce a co-accused. The last time I checked, it requires more than one person to commit adultery. D. The Torah requires that there be at least 2 witnesses to a crime, and that a witness be the first to commence execution, by casting the first stone, in effect, being the he who is without sin. The safeguard is found in Deuteronomy 13, verse 9, reading, "But you shall surely kill him, your hand is on him, in the first place, to put him to death, and the hand of all the people last." And 17, verses 6 to 7, reading, "By the mouth of 2 witnesses, or of 3 witnesses is he who is dead put to death. He is not put to death by the mouth of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses is on him, in the first place, to put him to death, and the hand of all the people last, and you have put away the evil thing out of your midst." And E. Although without sin, Rabbi Yeshua could not have been the he who is without sin in this context, as he had not personally witnessed the alleged act. Yeshua cared nothing for the laws of Rome, however, and consented to her execution, but only if the Torah's precautions had been taken for a safe conviction. They had not, so Yeshua stooped down and proceeded to write the names of her accusers in the sand. The accusers were convicted by their own sense of guilt, lost their nerve and departed. Only once it became clear that there were no genuine witnesses, and that no man had condemned her, did Yeshua dismiss the woman. The deception of the godless is to portray their spectrum of selfish and selective permissiveness as love for their fellow man and freedom. In contrast, the Bible's concept of love, from cover to cover, is that love is justice, and that justice is an act of mercy performed for the greater good and freedom of the people. Yeshua teachings express this impartial truth founded on justice and equality for all, as opposed to Pat's subjective reality and contempt. So it comes down to a question of real choice. Your choice. We've heard some of the lies told by the godless, and have heard the emotional harm they cause to children, but when all is said and done, what actual freedoms have the godless given them? Well, certainly not the most fundamental freedom, the right to life. Stay tuned for Part 3.